Hello and welcome to Security in Context. My name is Omar Dahi. Today I'm having a conversation with Professor Mark Denbeaux. Mark is a professor at Seton Hall and director of the Seton Hall Law School's Center for Policy and Research. Along with his colleagues, Mark published the indispensable report series on the Guantánamo Bay Detention Camp. Today we'll be having a conversation with Mark about his work and in particular about Zain al-Abidin Muhammad Hussein, or Abu Zubaydah. Abu Zubaydah was the first suspect to be taken into the CIA detention program in the aftermath of 2001 and became known for his diaries, among other things, and the sketches of torture that he endured while in custody, sketches that were published by the help of Mark and his team. Also joining me in this conversation is Professor Falguni Sheth. Professor Sheth is professor and chair of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Emory University. She's the author of several books, including Toward a Political Philosophy of Race and Unruly Women, Race, Neoliberalism, and the Hijab. Her research and public writing explore the intersection of violence, security, and technologies of race and racialization. Welcome, Falguni and Mark.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mark, I want to start by asking you about your experience as the legal counsel for Abu Zubaydah previously. You were his legal counsel for about 14 years. Can you tell us how and why you came to be involved with this case, and perhaps take us through some of the most important stages of this time period?
Sure. Abu Zubaydah is actually my fourth client who was detained in Guantanamo. Two have been released after about 10 years. Abu Zubaydah and a man named Bin Amin, also called Zubair, are still there. Zubair's trial has started. Abu Zubaydah's trial has not started and never will. He's really admitted to be a forever prisoner because they don't have evidence to convict him, with good reason, because he never did anything. And so he's sitting there languishing in every sense of the word now. In answer to the process, I think the most truthful answer is there's been almost no process. He appeared once and was told why he was detained and denied it, and all those allegations that were for the reason for his detention have been withdrawn by the CIA and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. The more relevant part about his detention comes with how he was caught and how the torture program was created just to torture him by name and only him, and then how he was in fact tortured. And the drawings that we were able to publish in two different reports are in fact very, very important examples. The last report, in which he was actually able to have his descriptions of the tortures, may well turn out to be the report that will be most likely recognized as describing America's torture in the torture program. But Zain, we call him Zain. Zain was significant because he was the first person captured by the CIA. And oddly, that was March 28th, 2002. Now, the CIA didn't catch many people, and he was the first one they caught. And they hoped and believed, based on misinformation, of which they had which was almost all their information. They hoped that he would be leading them into Al-Qaeda and all sorts of other things. Their problem was two things. One is they didn't know how to interrogate and find out what anybody knew because they weren't interrogators. As you can imagine, the CIA works only in foreign countries, and you can't go into Russia and grab somebody and take them someplace and ask them questions. They work mostly on electronic stuff and buying sort of spies. So they didn't know what they were doing. Now, he was badly wounded in the shootout when he was captured, and he almost died. And they were so concerned that he would die and they wouldn't get the information. They flew in surgeons from Johns Hopkins Hospital to save him. And they did, although his wounds had never really healed. So at that point, they then decided it was time to capture, it was time to interrogate him, but they didn't know how. So they hired two Air Force psychologists who were trained in something called the SARE program. And SARE is Survive, Evade, Resist, Escape. And it was designed for Air Force pilots who were downed. And the two people who took charge of the CIA's interrogation program were Mitchell and Jessen, formerly Air Force psychologists. And the CIA hired them because, as the deputy director of the CIA said, interrogating someone such as him is uncharted waters, and we didn't know how to do it. So they hired these two people who had never interrogated. They'd only taught American airmen how not to be interrogated, how not to surrender to torture. So the problem they have was that they slowly learned he didn't know anything. The FBI concluded that he knew nothing and objected to his techniques and withdrew on June 2nd. Now, one of the reasons that the CIA program was designed as it was the night before Abu Zubaydah was actually caught, March 27th, there was a high-level meeting in the CIA in which they were discussing how they wanted to box out everybody so they would be the exclusive sources of information from him. And this came about because they wanted to somehow redeem themselves for missing 9/11. The one thing I've never thought was fair to accuse the CIA about, but nobody could have predicted it. And they did tell President Bush on August 6th that in one of those famous presidential daily briefings that Osama bin Laden was planning to use airplanes to attack the United States. And they mentioned that Abu Zubaydah may have been part of that. Now, their source of information is always sort of odd. But what happened was the reason the CIA wanted to do all of the interrogation was obviously to redeem itself. But the only way they could do it was to come up with a method to do it that couldn't be used by the FBI. The FBI only interrogates through rapport building, which is the method they've used in America for decades, longer really, and that's been quite effective. But if the CIA techniques were only going to be something the FBI could do, the FBI would be known to have done it better. The CIA's problem is there were really three forms of interrogation. There's the sort of rapport building of the FBI. Then there is the military interrogation, which is mostly when you're in the field, you want to know what's over the next hill, and all you care about is preventing being ambushed. And they do that pretty well. And then you came to the CIA's new system, which was really designed to find people who they concluded didn't like America and were capable of coordinating with or cooperating with those who would attack it. This is, of course, an interrogation technique that's almost inconceivable. After all, if you're going after somebody because you think they don't like you, how do you know that? And if they think they're going to, they might be attacking you, how do you know that and what do you know? Now, I can go on and on with this, but they started his techniques in April. The FBI was participating part of the time with some of them. And in April and May, back and forth, the FBI and the CIA dealt with it. But that's because the torture program the CIA wanted to use was not approved till August 2nd. And by the way, the approval in August 2nd was approval to torture only one person, Abu Zubaydah. The Justice Department has never approved the torture of anyone else. And I'll throw one more thing in. After they got permission to use the techniques on July 13th, then they had to convince the Justice Department they had somebody it was appropriate to use them. And on July 24th, someone sent a psychological assessment to John Yoo of the Department of Justice saying 13 things about Abu Zubaydah. every one of which has been shown to be false. So I can go on and on, but I think that's the outline.
So Mark, you've given us a pretty important behind the scenes look about the treatment for Abu Zubaydah, and the rationale officially is behind Abu Zubaydah's continued incarceration is that even though the US had already determined that he was not an integral part of Al-Qaeda, he was brought to Guantanamo in 2006 after 4 years in CIA black sites. In 2017, Zubaydah's lawyers, presumably you were one of them, requested that you be allowed to depose 2 of his interrogators as part of a criminal probe into human rights violations in Poland, one of the countries where he was believed to have been tortured. But the US refused on grounds that state secrets might be revealed. But his counsel, presumably again, of which you were part of, pointed out that secrets have to be facts that are concealed, and there was so little that was concealed about the CIA detention site. So even Poland's president acknowledged that he had known and approved the detention center. So why do you think Abu Zubaydah is being prevented from being released or even allowed to depose as interrogators?
Well, I think that's 2 different things. The suit to sue his interrogators with their series of lawyers, and that was coordinated by another group of lawyers, led by Larry Lustberg. But the problem with that lawsuit, which was tried in Spokane, Washington, where Mitchell resided and they had jurisdiction over him, was not just for Abu Zubaydah. It was for several other people. And in fact, Abu Zubaydah was ultimately not included in that lawsuit. That was just because getting his consent to dealing with it and the working together with the ACLU got very complicated for those lawyers. So he was not a member of that lawsuit. And there was a settlement of some sort, not including him, that sealed and is not apparently a large sum of money. There were lots of reasons involving the state secrets that made suing in federal court much harder. But you're right about the state secrets, but that came up in the European Court of Human Rights. The lawsuit that Abu Zubaydah won first in Poland against Poland, and then in Lithuania against Lithuania, was the result of litigation in the European Court of Human Rights. And the interesting thing about that is that he ended up suing successfully the country of Poland just because Poland allowed the American people, the American government, to torture him in Poland. Poland didn't do anything except be the venue for America's torture. The same thing was true in Lithuania. They were able to get a judgment against him in Lithuania, also because Lithuania permitted America to torture him. And he got another 200,000 euros there. So the interesting thing about that is America had nothing to do and gets no credit for this result, including its legal system, which didn't participate.
So he's still there. You have already expressed doubt that he's ever going to be released. I think there's about 29 others who are there right now, along with Abu Zubaydah. And I'm wondering.
They don't pass out large numbers. I believe it's reduced now to about 18. So they've been drifting them out here and there along the way pretty quietly.
So what do you think the future holds for him and those who are remaining?
Well, they are going to keep letting people out. There are other people sort of lined up. I mean, I always claimed that we never declared victory in Iraq, never had troops coming home celebrating victory. All that happened is at some point they looked up and there were no troops in Iraq. So it was the easiest political way to just have Iraq disappear. Mm-hmm. I think it's basically the same thing as Guantanamo. There are now 17 or 18 people there. I know of 2 or 3 who are in the pipeline, perhaps even this year. And I think the interesting question really is, who will be left beside Abu Zubaydah? The negotiations are going on for 5 of them to be released, and they're the 5 who were involved in 9/11, or ostensibly, and one is involved with the Cole bombing. So if you take those out, there's only about 9 or 10 people. He's one of them. Abu Zubaydah, he's detained because he is the poster child for everything that's wrong in America's torture program. And the CIA is turned out to have another black eye after deciding they would take over interrogation in order to find out the information, failed to get any information. And their biggest problem is having picked one man to be the subject of their torture techniques and having the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence say, well, actually, he was never a member of Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden asked him to join in 1999 and he refused. And he refused because Abu Zubaydah is a Palestinian and his issue is liberating the occupied lands that are in Israel now. And that's a central issue for Palestinians. One of his ironic observations to me was that in course of a discussion, he said, Israel claims they were there first. He said, and even going back into the Old Testament, he said, the Old Testament proves we were there first. And I said, why? He said, look at the book of Judges. All the book of Judges is a series of battles attacking the Canaanites and he went through the series of others, the Philistines. He said, so we were there first, if that was the reason. I said, I don't think that's going to get you out.
That's probably right. It kind of leads to an interesting question about what the role of U.S. foreign policy in Palestine or with regard to Israel-Palestine is in continuing to keep him locked up. But the other thing I was going to ask you about is, I guess, about 10 years ago, they decided to no longer publish or advertise what was happening in Guantanamo. They stopped press releases after the hunger strikes were going on. I remember this, I think it was like 2013 or something like that. That the less attention, the better. And you kind of seem to confirm that as well. They're just not giving out a lot of information on this.
Well, they never gave out much, but you are right that it slowed down. In my mind, it started in 2013, although, the real hunger strikes were probably 2005 and 2006 when there were hundreds of people there. But I think you're right, it was around 2013. But the final blow to Guantanamo was the publication in December of 2014 of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And that was, in fact, the devastating statement that actually made it impossible for Abu Zubaydah to get out. Our original theory to get him out was we thought the CIA would not want the truth of what they did to him to be known. And so we would use keeping his torture a secret would be helpful for him. The CIA couldn't do that after the Senate Select Committee in December of 2014 published its 565-page summary, which showed everything that they had said in the first 10 years before that was completely false.
So you think it actually, you would have thought that it would have helped his case, but it didn't.
It absolutely did not, because he's a very articulate man. And they know that. And he's well educated and speaks English and was taught English in Saudi Arabia, went to universities in India, and he's very articulate, very clear, and expresses himself in a way that is temperate, factually correct, but not emotional. If he talks about his torture, if he talks about anything else, he can express it with some wit and with some understanding, and he would be a terrible person to describe the torture program.
Well, I guess, but the one part of the puzzle for me is, why did this not then engender, right, an insistence that he be allowed to go to trial? Why did it work in the opposite way?
Well, I think the people who made the decision were always the CIA. Remember, there's no legal system down there. The only thing we have are these military commissions, which are run by the Defense Department and the Department of Justice. But the decision as to who should be charged is not charged by a legal proceeding. I brought, on behalf of Zane, challenging the Massachusetts Bar Association to disbar the military prosecutor, General Martins, because he had failed to prosecute, had no plans to prosecute, and a prosecutor who refuses to prosecute and just keep someone locked up to avoid revealing the lack of evidence is a violation of all of the attorney ethics. The defense that persuaded the Massachusetts Bar Association not to take action against him was that the people who made the decision whether to prosecute were the leadership, and they're not lawyers, of the military commissions in Guantanamo.
Okay. Omar.
So they're the deciders. And the people who have hearings to decide him are 6 people from all of the intelligence agencies. So he's reviewed every couple of years, and you have the CIA and the DIA, and a series of other people, all of whom basically have to agree.
Mark, I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of, now there's a shift in U.S. foreign policy that China is and Russia, I guess, are the big enemies, and we're kind of leaving this, or we're supposed to, not talk about global war on terror anymore. But Abu Zubaydah is still in detention, and as you mentioned, may never leave.
Wait, I hope he'll leave. I want to make it clear. I have high hopes that hopes that I will someday meet him, but I'm 80 and the clock is running.
Yeah, and I think that's why I feel that there's a discussion that we should be having that we're not having. The attention has been shifted away from the plight of these detainees. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, how do you make sense of the fact that this whole experience for the past 20 years is now almost, being forgotten in U.S. kind of public discourse, there's no accountability, there's no continued discussion about what took place and what continues to be taking place. And I wanted to ask that in light of, I guess this is, a two-part question, in light of the fact that over the past few years, we've had increasing discussions about mass incarceration, police brutality, and the historic level of racist violence that this country has experienced, dating back to slavery and after slavery. And if we were kind of to zoom out and think about, how would you assess placing this experience of the U.S. treatment of the Guantanamo detainees, the torture program, how would you put that in the history of overall U.S. experience towards the treatment of the indigenous population, Black people, and over the years? I mean, how unique is it, or how much is it something that should be thought of in light of that broader history?
Well, I think the broader history does explain almost everything, but so does the smaller history and the middle history. It's not as if there's a very big difference, with, in my mind, one exception. I think where accountability never happens is when the issue is too big. It's too big to fail. We have a global war on terror. Who is it that you're going to prosecute for that? Dick Cheney, George Bush, any number of other people who are dealing with it. They're never going to be able to be brought in. And I think that's kind of true in a sense when involved Americans dropping bombs on Japan and dealing with a series of other things. No accountability comes for that. Now, maybe there shouldn't be. Maybe some people were making decisions that were not criminal. But, the people who end up getting prosecuted, in my generation, the Vietnam War was the problem. And we killed over 1 million Vietnamese. And what accountability have we had for that? And we did it by dropping Agent Orange. We used chemicals. We would interrogate people in helicopters, and if they fell out, that was a deterrent or an encouraging other people to talk. the people we prosecuted were the low-ranking officers like Calley, Lieutenant Calley, for doing what he claimed he was supposed to do. And it was okay to go after him. And it's undoubtedly okay to go after individual people at some point if they fall into that category. But let's not forget, Vietnam was a 15-year war, and that involved Asians and yellow people, and nobody cared. But I also think that the real difference is Americans versus everybody else. I mean, I think it's one thing to prosecute people from other countries for doing something. To get people to prosecute Americans for what they did, especially in a large venture, everybody comes along and says it'll be too painful. We just have to let them go. And the politics of it protects Americans. And really, we don't care very much about the other victims. We only care about blacks because they're here. If they had left the country after the Civil War or after 1965, nobody would be paying any attention to reparations or anything else.
Yeah, kind of a deportation mentality. Mark, I want to go back to kind of a couple of questions ago where we were talking about the hunger strikes, which raised the most recent controversy, which is, whether or not Ron DeSantis was a defense lawyer for some of these detainees, including
No, he was never a defense lawyer. He was a JAG lawyer. He would have been on the side of the military. The defense lawyers were, yeah, okay.
Sorry, I misspoke. And so the accusations against by some of the detainees who were there at the time were that he was there, he watched, they thought that he was actually somehow going to help defend them, and that he, laughed while they were being force-fed. And now the New York Times, as of yesterday, has published a piece saying, well, these claims are unfounded because we can't find any evidence, written evidence to that effect, which sounds ludicrous to me. But I guess I'm just kind of curious to hear your take on this controversy.
Well, I've been asked a lot about it.
Okay.
I was representing 4 people who were there at the time. I was there in 2006 with my son the weekend before the 3 suicides or murders. And that was during the time that DeSantis was there. I've become very close to a military intelligence analyst who was purportedly just a guard there, who has revealed a great deal of information about abuses in Guantanamo. His name's Joseph Hickman. And the people I've spoken to really don't believe that he was involved in any of those activities. Now, I'm sure he wasn't there to defend anybody. That's clearly laughable. But the fact that the only question they're asking is, was he in the room when they were being force-fed? That's the only thing I've ever heard. And then, of course, the first theory was he was just there as an observer, maybe a rubbernecking, wanting to watch a car accident. But I think the fact is that I was told that he was viewed as the youngest, most junior, greenest JAG lawyer there. They called him the runner because he was running all over constantly all the time. Wherever you looked, there would be this guy running around. And they recognized him after a while for that purpose. I've spoken to one of the people who remembers him being there. And I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm never going to dispute it. But it's based on his memory of what DeSantis looked like. And what's interesting is he said he remembered him because DeSantis was so handsome. He was distinctly handsome. So I don't know what to make of it. There's certainly very little evidence that he was in the room. And, the people doing that wouldn't have wanted an officer watching. You wouldn't want to be watching somebody do something for a million reasons. So I don't know what to make of it. Obviously, I think his claim that he was trying to defend them and protect them proves he's a liar. And that's inconceivable. I just don't know where to go. And one of my goals here is there's so much evil in Guantanamo that I don't feel the need to look to scratch and find some additional ones if they're not true, because there's a credibility issue. After all, there's so much ugliness there that trying to pin it on a particular person who was there, especially when you're dealing with detainees who, while he was there, were being force-fed and probably had other things on their mind. So I'm not saying he wasn't there. I'm saying it's not, from my point of view, especially helpful to get in a fight as to who was in the room watching, even if that person was seemingly a plausible candidate for president. Now it's even less important.
And that's right. I mean, part of the reason that I'm interested is to kind of get a sense of, what the temperament was back then, and whether that tells us anything about what a potential administration and, under DeSantis's name would foretell for us. So that was one of the reasons that I was asking.
Yeah. By the way, if you want to find out, the person who is the most clear and most compelling explanation of his presence there is Mansour Adafi, and you can reach him by WhatsApp, and he will talk.
Yes.
So if you want the connections, you can certainly do that, and you could use my name.
That's really helpful information. Thanks. And I guess, so I'm actually a philosopher who was writing a lot about Guantanamo for the first 15 years or so. And so part of what I have been thinking about is, and because you're an attorney, part of the entrance into trying to challenge this stuff is to do so on procedural grounds, to do so on legal grounds. And obviously this is a case where all procedure seems to be thrown out the window. But I'm still interested. Is there any way that something like Guantanamo could have been legally, institutionally avoided? Or, is there something that could have been put in place to prevent this if it was just a matter of kind of political will to put people in jail to fulfill a kind of larger political bloodthirst? I mean,
I think that's the bloodthirst is the question, right? You're right about that. I mean, I think it's also important, perhaps rather than being shocked that we would do this, it may be more important to accept the fact that we will always do this. Mm-hmm. That it seemed to me, America, when things are going well, America behaves properly. But when America gets, for instance, terrified, scared, panicked, and feeling threatened, and it's pervasive across the country, it's not likely our systems are going to stand up and resist that in those intense times. I mean, my belief is that we've forgotten all of the hundreds and maybe thousands of people who were arrested after 9/11 and held as material witnesses and finally released. Years ago, the observation was that, there were no cab drivers around and there were no gas station attendants because that's where many Middle Easterners were working. And they were all rounded up and picked up, not unlike Japan. So, I mean, I think Japan was another panic time, right? It was totally wrong. And everybody admits it. And they really should have known it at the time. And they did. And I think the same thing is true of Guantanamo. Guantanamo is a political disaster for America. They brought people to Guantanamo in orange jumpsuits and shackles and putting them in Camp X-Ray to show how fiercely we were detaining them to make sure they would never get out. I was there in those early years, and the guards were all told, don't ever give them your real name. Mm-hmm. Nobody in Guantanamo has a badge that identifies themselves by their real name. Mm-hmm. Whether you're a JAG lawyer and a major or captain or a colonel, you always have fake names because they're all taught that if they ever get out and they figure out who you are, they'll go to your hometown and rape and murder your women, your wives, your daughters, your children because of how you've detained them. And you have a whole lot of 19, 20-year-old low-ranking military people who believe it. And they kind of wanted to believe it. Who would want to believe you're guarding a whole lot of hapless, not very significant people who know nothing and aren't a threat? But how would you be zealously dealing with that? So the public relations problem was brought about because America wanted to show they're winning the global war on terror by catching all these people and showing how aggressively they were detaining them as circumstantial evidence that they were so important because they needed it, when they didn't. And they needed the guards to believe that was important, because how else could you have the guards be vigilant if you think they're a bunch of, sheep farmers here?
Well, I'm sorry to hear this answer, but unfortunately, that seems right.
Well, I think it's true of it. In some sense, we also exaggerate our goodness. Every country has its really dark moments, and over history and over time. And to some extent, the previous question was sort of, how come we've forgotten about all of this? In another sense, it's not good to forget, because Americans need to realize not that we're bad people, but just that we're ordinary people. And when we get scared, ordinary people do frightened, bad, angry things. And I think that we've always done that, but I think every country does that. So I'm kind of believe that part of our problem is this American exceptionalism. We're like every other country. Once somebody does something bad to us, we get scared and we strike out at somebody. And if we can't find somebody, we can't find the right person, we find somebody, as in Abu Zubaydah.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Thank you, Mark. These are some, I guess, great things to think about in light of the fact that as I mentioned, the U.S. government now has another target that it's scaring us about, and hopefully,
which one is that?
China now is the big threat, right? That's the
right. I just can't keep up.
National security is now compromised, and we need to impose sanctions and prevent them from having chips and increase military spending in all sorts of ways. So, I think the work that you've done has been so crucial, you and your team, in shedding light on this awful episode. And I think, despite your semi-pessimistic words, I think it's really just a triumph for humanity that you were able to kind of bring this out, this negative episode, because it kind of shows that there's people kind of pursuing the truth and pursuing accountability as much as possible, and really informing the public. So thank you for all that work, and I appreciate you joining us today.
You're welcome. I'm not sure I'm so negative about it. Well, I guess maybe it's hard to figure out my moods on all of this. Certainly negativity is a big part of it, but there's also a sense that history needs to put all of these things in context and realize they're constantly happening, and China may well become one of them.
Right.
Great. Thank you. Thank you,
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
Thanks, Mark.
My pleasure. Thank you.